I'm Sean Fennessey, and this is The Big Picture, a conversation show about serial killers. Don't worry, everything is fine here on the show, but we have to talk about a very important new film this week. That film is Longlegs. Longlegs, a disturbing new thriller from Osgood Perkins. Perkins, a gifted creator of genuine discomfort and images that get seared onto your brain. I talked with him about how he does it, crafting a killer with Nicolas Cage as star, the figure that his father, Anthony Perkins' work in Psycho casts over his career, and a lot more. Oz, genuinely an amazing guest, a great talker, very smart guy, very forthcoming about his career in Hollywood. I hope you'll stick around for our conversation. But first, another serial killer, a killer of takes, Rob Mahoney, co-host of Group Chat, co-host of the Prestige TV podcast. What else are you doing, Rob?
Mostly those things, hopefully killing this podcast. But
Nice.
we all know to understand the killer, you must become the killer. I've been diving deep into the serial killer log, and I have to say it's all very cool and great and well adjusted over here.
I reached out to you and I said, what movie do you want to talk about on the pod in the upcoming future? You put Longlegs on the list.
Yeah.
And
on the list, we should say. There were many alternative options that would have been better for my mental health than you picking Longlegs.
but I saw Longlegs and I thought of you in many ways. I felt like you were the man for the job. This is
Okay.
a movie that has been much anticipated, much marketed. There's been a lot of stray tweets about this being the most terrifying and upsetting movie that we have seen in years. It's a really interesting movie. It's Perkins's fourth film. It stars Micah Monroe and the aforementioned Nicolas Cage as the titular Longlegs. It's a story about a serial killer and the unusual manner in which his crimes are committed and the inexplicable nature of it. And an FBI agent in the 1990s, very similar to a Clarice Starling type from Silence of the Lambs, who has an unusual relationship to these murders and has an incredible ability to work inside of this case.
Right.
The movie itself is simultaneously a standard issue serial killer thriller and also a fascinating subversion / homage to those movies. So later in this episode, we're going to talk about our serial killer movie canon, the sort of the 10 movies that best, represent what these movies are trying to accomplish. But I thought after having seen the movie, this idea makes even more sense now because the movie is so interested in the archetypes of these stories, but not necessarily fulfilling those archetypes all the way through. So I'll start with this. Was Longlegs the most upsetting, horrifying, difficult film you've seen in years?
It was very upsetting. And in addition to being, as you said, at times a serial killer movie, at times it's a subversion, it's just a nonstop dread machine, which often is my favorite part of other serial killer movies, is just this background sense that the characters are being watched, that you're being watched, that you're doing the watching. Serial killer movies have a way of kind of like turning the camera on you and pointing the finger at you for being involved in them. And you feel very involved with Longlegs, whether you want to be or not. Like you are pulled into the feeling of this movie.
Do you like having that feeling at the movies? Because I've talked about that before many times, that like I'm dead inside. And in order to feel things, I have to go to very upsetting films so that I can feel a charge and I can remember what it was like to have been 9 or 13 or 18.
Yeah,
and
when
now
you
as I
last serial killed.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to say that into a microphone. But I obviously love that sensation that you're describing. And that is a feature of the movie, though that is not the movie in its entirety. But do you like that feeling of like that ominous sense of doom that pervades a movie like this?
I do like that feeling. I usually stop short of really hardcore horror. And so that's why this genre kind of works for me, because there's usually some procedural trappings. It's like half solving a case, or in Longlegs' case, trying to understand what sort of case you're solving. Is this a supernatural occurrence? Is this just a madman or a serial killer out there on the loose? I like having that sort of remove most of the time in terms of the really, really gnarly stuff. And so this lets me have my cake and eat it too a little bit. I can enjoy the depravity of a serial killer movie and the grisliness of some of the kills. And I think what makes Longlegs so effective is it's pretty unsparing in terms of not showing you all of the violence, but hinting at it enough that your brain starts filling in the blanks and it does a lot of the work for the movie in a way.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that this is not really a horror movie.
No.
And even though, say, for example, the Saw franchise features a serial killer, the feature of those movies are the kills. They're the set piece kills where we see someone, undergoing an incredibly grisly experience. This movie, very much like Silence of the Lambs, very much like Seven, very much like some of the signature movies that we'll talk about, is much more oriented around understanding the case of the
Yeah.
serial killer.
Reverse engineering crime scenes as much as anything.
Right. And you would think that that would be kind of banal, and even especially with this kind of self-consciousness that it has about the movies that have come before, you would think that that would not be an effective way to tell a story like this, honestly, because we're a culture now increasingly that wants like more and more grisliness. And so one of the things that fascinates me about this movie is that part of it seems like the driving force of the film. And I don't want to spoil it yet. We will get into spoilers in about 10 minutes, but that also is a wrong footing. The movie, for the first hour, it feels like we're watching Micah Monroe's character, the FBI agent character, solving Zodiac-style puzzles and getting closer and closer to understanding what's happening in this case. And it feels like something we've seen before, but we can't help but be curious if she's going to crack the case. And then the movie sort of shifts its perspective on how we were meant to feel about that solving, which I thought made the movie less scary but more profound to me. I don't know how you felt about the decision to kind of wrong foot us that way.
Yeah, I think we can get into the specifics of the ending a little later, but I love the format in that way. You're never quite sure what sort of movie you're watching or what might be around every corner. I know that's a classic horror movie thing, but there's something in Longlegs where everything feels a half tick off.
Yeah.
Down to Micah Monroe's performance, where she's incredibly aggressively antisocial, like has a very hard time interacting with other human beings. And all the places that she's going in this investigation are these neighborhoods where everything is dead. Like there's no people, there's no cars, there's just this eerie sort of silence. And in between all that, you get these flashes of this weird, vague, disturbing kind of imagery. And that's like, a lot of that is looped into what Micah's character is like sensing in the movie, and this feeling that if she doesn't have a kind of psychic perception, she at least has an intuition that maybe other detectives don't. Like she clearly has something going on that's helping her solve this case. And you're getting that like the hair standing on the back of your neck feeling watching her go through it because of the way it's all presented.
So one of the things that I think is such an amazing success of this movie is it takes something that Oz Perkins is really good at, which is just very simple but beautiful and symmetrical composition in a frame. There are a lot of really clearly defined, sustained images in the movie that feel like not a painting per se, but like something that draws you in closer and closer, the way that abstract art might draw you closer and closer. In his previous movies, that felt a little overmanaged and a little bit too prescribed. In this movie, because of the character that we're following in Micah Monroe, who we feel like her mind is almost working in that way, as we're seeing everything from her perspective when she's sitting at her desk and looking at this symbology, or when she's at a crime scene and she's analyzing a room, which is an empty room with furniture opposite each other that feels matched, and something feels off, and there's a tension in the sound design, but it's like, is what's off in her mind, or is what's off in this room? Is what's off in this town, or is this just her imagination or a flashback of some kind to a moment? It's a really perfect execution of something that Perkins was already doing well, but he found a way to tell a story that suited that style so well. So even though the movie as it goes along, I think, starts to not just like strain credulity of the logic of the story, but becomes like kind of bewildering at times where you're trying to really understand what is happening. It works because we've been set into a world where we don't actually know what is happening. It's hard to know what is the reality of the story. And so I was just kind of like, it's hard to know, like, how do you rate a movie like Longlegs? Well, I'm like, it fucked me up for a lot of what I was watching. That. So that's definitely what it was going for. And then after I talked to Perkins, as is often the case on this show, understanding his intentionality a lot more and understanding what he was thinking about when he was making the movie deepens the movie for me. I'm reluctant to kind of share too much of what he said. I want people to hear it for themselves. But, without spoiling the movie, did you feel like it like sustained that feeling that we're describing and then followed through on it by finishing the kind of narrative aspects of it?
It did for me. And I think some of that will depend on how you deal with different kinds of mysteries. If you're someone who needs every loop closed for you, Longlegs might not be a very satisfying experience. But I say that in a way that almost feeds into the Longlegs hype machine. You talked about all the reviews, all the response. I think some of the reason you're getting that is because it's a very hard movie to put your finger on and a very hard movie to talk about, not just in a spoiler-free way, but in any sort of way. And because of that, it sticks with you. Like this movie is going to hang over you for a while in a way that might be frustrating from a certain kind of puzzle boxy perspective if you're that kind of thinker. But if you're just there for the tension and the vibe and trying to understand this movie on its own terms, I think it's going to hang with you in a really good way, if also one that may give you nightmares for years.
Yeah. So, I mean, it literally did. And I've said that on the show before. And I want to explain specifically what I mean by that, maybe when we start spoiling a little bit. But one of your most memorable appearances on the show is the Nicolas Cage Hall of Fame. Nick Cage, a favorite of yours, a favorite of mine, of course.
Absolutely.
I mentioned to Oz that I feel like he's on his like 8th comeback now. You know, it's like once again after Dream Scenario and a couple of other movies, people are like, oh, Nicolas Cage is back for, you know, another round of we forgot how great he is despite 3 to 7 VOD movies that no one saw in between his great masterpieces. This performance I find really interesting. I've seen it's been very divisive. Some people think that the movie really works despite him. Some people think it really works in part because of what he's doing in the movie. What did you think of him in the part in general? And do you feel like it is Hall worthy? Do we have to, you know, reanalyze our picks?
Well, we need to reanalyze our picks because we left Pig out.
We also left out
I
National
mean
Treasure.
You and Van. I'm willing to cut anything to get Pig in there, and I do think this is my trouble with the Nicolas Cage experience as a cageologist. It always works for me. Even when he's not in the right movie, it kind of works for me. And so I'm almost surprised to hear that this one has been divisive because I think it's very effective. I think there's no way that any still or trailer could have done it justice. So I'm glad the marketing has been as such very, very careful, kind of concealing what he's doing. It's a huge performance, as it always is. But I think Longlegs is very smart about how much it shows to you and when. And he's really, really going for it to the point that I would say he's unrecognizable even by Cage standards.
It's kind of fascinating when we first see him and then the sort of, I don't know if it's an evolution. It's really more of a de-evolution that his character goes over from the 70s to the 90s. But that first moment when we see him in the film, this opening sequence, which is so effective and so perfectly sets the tone because it is so confounding, is you see a younger version of this damaged person and you only see him from a particular angle. He's shot so his eyes are not revealed. And it's a very clever choice because it confuses us in terms of like, when are we? Not just where are we, but what time period, what is the milieu that we're supposed to be understanding that we're in? And the movie like doesn't go out of its way to explain when we're flashing back or not. It doesn't try to even show like, well, this is the character that I was talking about and they're going to show up 20 years later. It's got a very kind of elliptical sense of time that I think is very effective.
And a timelessness in the dress and the costuming and the staging where you're never quite sure if that flashback was a flashback or if that's just a cutaway to a victim now. It's really hard to know.
Yeah, and the only way that you can really know is when we start seeing Longlegs' face. That's really the giveaway for when we're sort of understanding the time periods and, you know, what Micah Monroe's character, what she's actually interrogating and investigating. I thought Cage was really good in this, and I only think that now because of something that Perkins said to me. And I'll just use that as an entryway into a spoiler discussion.
Okay.
So if you don't want to have Longlegs spoiled for you, thank you for coming along for the ride so far. I'd encourage you to check this out. It's a very cool movie from a very interesting filmmaker. And if you don't want to hear anything, turn the pod off. Okay, so here's the thing about Longlegs. This is a movie, as Perkins described to me, about how our interest in serial killer mythology is pathetic and we should never be glorifying these figures, and that his intention was to make Longlegs a kind of weird, pathetic guy who was super into glam rock and got interested in Satan. And
as one does.
As well, I won't say I'm into all of those things, but some of those things are interesting to me. And I understood what he was doing by having Cage do this kind of high-pitched man who's getting plastic surgery and attempting to be kind of beautiful by being ugly and, you know, listening to an anti-god and trying to follow through on his vision. But also that there's like a silliness, a stupidness, and a grossness to creating this like mythology around a figure like that. And it feels like Cage very much understood that they were on the same page about that because there is a real silliness to his performance, you know?
Oh, definitely.
And even though the movie in the first 40 minutes doesn't really give you any of that silliness, once it is revealed with his dramatic hand gestures and his very Mark Bolan inflected physicality, you realize that like the movie thinks he sucks, you know, like these guys are awful, and our culture of true crime and venerating David Fincher movies and all these things that I participate in and that we're going to talk about as we get into the thing is a bit silly, and that there's actually something much deeper going on, which is that this is really a movie about families and about parenthood and about what your parents give you or don't give you, what they protect you from and what they don't protect you from. And as the movie is sort of revealing who is ultimately responsible for these murders, because the circumstances of the murders are quite curious, where we know that Longlegs is a participant in the murders, but he's not actually committing any of the crimes. He's just kind of insinuating an idea, and that idea is then encouraging the men in those homes to kill their families. It's a very clever setup and idea that like isn't really neatly resolved because of Micah Monroe's character's relationship to the story and ultimately her mother's relationship to the story. And so by the time you get to the end of the movie, and I said this to Oz, I was like, Longlegs is kind of incidental in the movie Longlegs. He's not really the point of the movie at all. The point of the movie is something much deeper and much more compelling. And you can say the same thing about Silence of the Lambs, that Clarice's journey is not just about Hannibal Lecter.
Sure.
But that Hannibal Lecter overtook that film and its entire world because of the profundity of the performance and because of the kind of all-knowing power of Hannibal. And this movie dispenses with its serial killer. Actually, he dispenses with himself.
He does.
In this dramatic and kind of funny way that's very gross.
Yeah. A kind of funny way that I don't think I'll ever forget. Like that scene of Cage bashing his head against the table until his nose basically caves in. Look, this is not a perfect movie. And I think if you plotted it out, I'm sure you could find little ways in which it doesn't quite add up or the mechanics don't quite work. It requires some imagination. It requires some connecting of dots on your own. But there are these thrillers that come along that just worm their way into your subconscious. Like I think about Jordan Peele's Us in this way, where it's not perfect, but I think about The Doubles and the Golden Scissors and some of the iconography of that movie. It just kind of constantly comes up for me. That's what I feel like Longlegs is going to be. And I feel like it's going to be that way because of that portrayal, because it is so wimpy. And because Longlegs himself is not physically intimidating. Even from the first time he shows up, I think the only way he would be physically intimidating is as an adult to a child. Mm-hmm. But once Lee's mom shows up, this is not a particularly scary person in a way that he's wielding a knife. He's just kind of scary in a way that your brain is trying to resolve. Like something is unsettling here, and I can't quite tell you what it is. And the fact that he is so weaselly and slimy and not like a physical threat, I think feeds into that.
Yeah, he's ultimately a creep, and a creep with some really sinister undertones and ideas, but a creep. And I really like what you said about how it kind of doesn't matter whether you feel like it wraps up tightly and neatly as you want it to. Like
we should say, making sense, very overrated.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Like even in the great thrillers and horror serial killer movies that wrap up well, they don't always make sense. Like Us is a really good example of a movie that, that's one of the first movies that I feel like Amanda and I on this show really dug into deeply because we knew it was a big event, Peele's, follow-up to Get Out. And we saw it twice and we kind of talked through like, what does this movie mean? And how do the mechanics of the doubling work? And ultimately, like, just fine podcast fodder, but like, it doesn't really matter because of what you're talking about, where like there are images that are seared into your mind. There are ideas that kind of seep into the way that you think about genre storytelling or what they mean to just you as a person or society. Peele and Perkins are friends, no surprise. And Perkins has a very similar skill set. Even Psycho, which stars Perkins' dad, has like a legit terrible ending where like a psychiatrist explains to the police officer and the victim's sister that this is a man with a schizophrenic multiple personality disorder. And it's like, it's fucking terrible. It doesn't matter. Like there's so much good, so much beauty and so much science and art in Psycho that it is one of these very few movies that has like a 7-decade shelf life and doesn't expire and still matters to the culture, even though it resolves in such like a flimsy way. I don't think Longlegs is Psycho, and I'm not trying to say that either, but I like what you put your finger on there, which is sort of like, I think people initially will see this movie after all the pre-release hype and they'll be like, was that good? Like, I'm not sure if that was good, but as I said, I mean, I would circle back to this. About a week or so after seeing the movie, my daughter woke up in the middle of the night.
Mhm.
That happens from time to time. She's crying. She was upset. She wanted to be soothed. Her mom goes in to soothe her. Got her back down fine. She comes back in. Her mom falls back to sleep, and I can't get back to sleep. And I'm laying in bed, and I'm trying to fall asleep. And I can feel, that liminal space between we're locked in and we're sleeping, and we're trying really hard, but we can't. And you get that
Yes.
the fluttering eyes and the body shake and that very curious position that you're in at
It's the
3 o'clock
sleep
in the
version
morning.
of being between "It's so over" and "We're so back."
Yes, it's between the first and the second apron is where we are here. Um,
Okay.
and I'm in this space, and with my eyes closed, I see Longlegs' face. And this never happens to me. I never dream. I never have nightmares. I'm not afraid of anything really.
Yeah.
And I can see Cage at that first reveal of his face. And even though I know that it's ridiculous, I'm very, very scared and
Yes.
and terribly like awoken like a fright. And that's how I know the movie worked. You know what I mean? Like I don't know if that's like a 5-star classic, but it means that they accomplished something, even in doing something that is like homage and absurd and meant to be a little bit jokey and flimsy. It's still, because of that ominous dread that you were describing, the movie is ultimately very, very successful for me. Do you have nightmares, Rob?
I do. I haven't yet about Longlegs, but I wouldn't put it past me. And not just him too, but the image of the sort of black cloaked figure with the eyes poking through.
That is so fucked up. That image is so fucked up.
I think that's going to get me at some point. And honestly, too, the other thing that this movie does so well in the dread and some of the imagery that sticks with me is the cold detachment of a lot of just the characters' facial expressions. In particular, Alicia Witt as Lee's mom. Holy fuck.
Didn't know she had this in her.
I did not know she had this in her. I've enjoyed her in many things, nothing
Mhm.
quite like this. And she's the key so much to, obviously, how you feel watching this movie is important, but what you're thinking about coming away from this movie comes a lot from her character and that idea that you mentioned of like what parents are willing to do for their children and the sort of suffering that can hide inside the best intentions. I think she does a phenomenal job. What this does well, whether it's trying to be an actual serial killer movie or not, is I feel like the best serial killer movies always, you walk away from them not quite knowing how to feel about humanity as a project, just like feeling a little bit more suspect of everyone around you. And her character unlocks that part of it, where it's like, there's a part of this in a lot of us. There's a part of that defensiveness and protectiveness and that instinct to herd your family together no matter what it does to anybody else. And what you're willing to do to lock that part of you away, whether it requires literal Satan or not, is something worth exploring.
It's really powerfully conveyed. Like that part of it actually worked very well on me. And sometimes a theme like that can feel really heavy-handed, and
Yes.
especially in this kind of like A24 era of elevated horror and all that stuff that we've talked about over the years. This is not that. Like
No.
it is in a way, but the movie is not insisting on that idea. It is confronting you with it.
Yes.
And
It doesn't
there's
feel
a-
like the real killer is generational trauma. There's more going on, and it's more deftly handled and more involved than that.
The other thing about this movie too is that it doesn't feel like, it feels like an independent movie. It's Blair Underwood and Alicia Witt. You know, it's not Denzel and Meryl Streep. It's not
Right.
even like John David Washington and Florence Pugh. Like it's not.
I mean, I would watch the hell out of that if anyone's
I
offering
would
to make
too,
it.
and maybe we should make that movie. But it's not hip. You know what I mean? Like that's why I think the marketing campaign and the pre-release hype is kind of fascinating, because
Yeah.
it's just like it's a weird indie that has somehow found its way into the cool stream of movie podcasters talking about whether or not an idea works in a movie. But it's the kind of movie that, like, if things broke a little bit left instead of right, it would just be a CR classic on VOD.
Right.
And it isn't that in a fascinating way. And so I think in a way that has me kind of like even more interested in it. I'm rooting for it more and more interested about kind of like what place it takes in the culture as well. I don't know if that resonates for you.
Yeah, it has to be that perfect constellation of stuff. And I think that kind of brings us back to the idea of whether Longlegs visually and audibly works or not, like the character Longlegs. It's now become part of the marketing that they attached a microphone to Micah Monroe to measure her heartbeat when she first saw Nick Cage in costume, which is genius level shit. and also very harrowing. And I challenge anyone who goes to see this movie not to feel some version of that during that scene in particular, when Lee is walking into the interrogation room. Classic serial killer setup. It takes twists and turns you won't expect, but just the visual of seeing him off the bat works. And there's so many things in this movie that just work in that way. It may not all be to your sensibility. It may not all be to your philosophy of how you want to approach movies in the first place. I just don't see how you could come out of Longlegs without something to hold on to, or something that's kind of grabbing hold of you.
I think that's really more than you can ask for from a movie. Like
Right?
it holds on to you and you hold on to it is a lot these days. So I'm grateful for it. I recommend it. I think it's very good.
Did Gru not hold on to you? Did you not come out of Despicable Me with real food for thought?
I mean, it held on to my wallet. And probably will continue to do so as I raise a child in this world and
Yeah,
the
you're stuck,
Minions
unfortunately.
Illumination franchise grows. Serial killer movies. How was your experience researching these films?
Just great. Just lovely. Had a great
What did
time.
you do? How did you approach it? Did you just rewatch the classics? Did you look at stuff you'd never seen before? How'd you think about it?
I was mostly trying to watch things I hadn't seen before, while also making time for some of the zanier half-genre entries, just as a change of pace and a palate cleanser. There's a lot of weird, kind of funny serial killer stuff out there. And let me tell you, like, watching Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer and Angst back to back is like not how I would advise anyone spends their time. And so afterwards, yeah, let's throw on Virtuosity and have some fun with it.
That's the thing, is it's a pliable subgenre because you can shift tone. Like you can play something very severe like Angst, or you can play something satirically comic like American Psycho, or you can play something just straight up comic like Virtuosity, which is maybe not trying to be as funny as it actually is, but it's pretty damn
It's great,
funny.
though.
I did something similar. I looked at a couple things I hadn't seen in a while and a couple things I'd never seen before. Not a ton of discoveries. This is a kind of a pet project for me, movies like this, and it's a pet project for unsurprisingly compositionally minded obsessives, which is
Of
what
course.
filmmakers are, and frankly what a lot of serial killers are. There's a reason this lends itself so well perspective wise as a storytelling device. It also has roots in like classic auteur theory, Psycho and Peeping Tom by Michael Powell, and M, the Fritz Lang movie. Like those movies being such critical entry points into the thriller canon has been so inspirational and so influential on so many filmmakers. And you can feel people making their M, making their Psycho. In Maxine, there's like not one, not two, but like 5 overt references to Psycho. Maybe
And you're told
overstated
about it,
references.
which is important.
Yeah. So it's hard to know how to do this. Like, I think we're going to have to pick and choose different archetypes
Yes.
so that we don't get overloaded. I want to give you at least one idiosyncratic pick here that you're like, I didn't know I loved this, or I've always loved this, even though it's not in the, and I'll do the same.
That's a lot of, that's very gracious of you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm nothing if not gracious on this pod, as all listeners know. I do think that trio plus the Night of the Hunter, the Charles Lawton movie. So M, Night of the Hunter, Psycho, and Peeping Tom feel like the building blocks of these kinds of movies. They're each about different kinds of killers who have different kinds of victims, and what they look for and what their psychology is, and the way that the stories are framed and told. All 4 of those movies happen to be like some of the most gorgeously constructed movies. Charles Lawton, of course, only made one movie. It's this great movie. If you haven't seen it, Robert Mitchum plays a kind of false preacher, who is a child murderer and is simultaneously incredibly entrancing and terrifying. In M, of course, Peter Lorre plays a serial killer in Germany. Psycho is Psycho, and Peeping Tom is this. I wanted to mention Peeping Tom because there's a documentary coming out that I'll recommend to you and everybody else who's listening called Made in England, the films of Powell and Pressburger, that is narrated by Martin Scorsese. It comes out in a couple of weeks. And it's my favorite kind of movie documentary, where it's just like someone super smart just walks you through the filmmaker's filmography. And so through a series of clips and personal experience, it's just Scorsese being like, and here's what, Powell and Pressburger's Canterbury Tales means. And here's, it's just
incredible.
It's just crack for movie documentary nerds. But Peeping Tom is this really interesting artifact. It's only Powell. Pressburger didn't participate in that movie. It's made in 1960, well after their glory days, making Archer's films in England. And it was publicly decried, derided, critically reviled, thought to be a disgusting portrait of a vile person. And
It is those things.
It is those things. But in a way, like why have art if you can't push the boundaries of the way that it is told? In 1960, obviously, the same year that Psycho was released, it was revolutionary and discomforting, but it's a great movie. And those 4 movies I feel like are really important in the conversation. And then from there, I think we have a lot of flexibility. I have broken this into 4 categories. I don't know if you feel like I've missed a category or there's something critical here that isn't being discussed.
I think these are fairly broken up. I guess my first question is, do we think those 4 building block icon picks are those absolute locks?
Well, we can talk about it. I'd love to negotiate a Hall of Fame, a canon on this podcast.
Yeah. It's
going to be tough.
It's tough to omit any of them, to be honest with you. And yet I find myself wanting to consolidate to make room for other things potentially.
Yeah,
but I guess we'll see where we
virtuosity. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's just call those the icons.
Okay.
At the outset. The next set would be the New Hollywood Killers. This is roughly 1969 through 1980, 1981.
Yep.
Now, I don't really think that serial killer movies are slasher movies.
This is a dilemma. Should we draw some lines around this stuff? Is that helpful? Can we even do that?
Yeah. Michael Myers is a serial killer.
Yes.
There's no question about it. But Halloween is not a serial killer movie from my perspective.
No.
Do you agree with that?
I agree with that. And I find myself in similar exercises with killing spree movies or home invasion movies, or like is Giallo a serial killer friendly genre, or is that its own thing? There's a lot of overlap, but I'm not quite sure.
It's a great question. I didn't list any Dario Argento movies, though you could very easily put Deep Red. Like Deep Red is a serial killer movie.
That's the obvious
question.
pick for sure.
But I'm not putting it here. Maybe that's wrong. But you're right that this kind of subgenre and subcategorization confuses it, because I think the 90s, which is the next kind of, or the last era, but the sort of the next era, the sort of Reagan wave of films that were sort of using like social moments to communicate through serial killers. And then the 90s wave that codified these movies as like commercial enterprises, like vehicles for great filmmakers to draw in audiences, which is very unusual given where like how Peeping Tom was received.
Yeah.
But the slashers and the giallos they're like playthings for movie dorks, you know? And Seven is a movie that everybody goes to see on Friday night.
It's true.
And there is a difference. And so maybe I'm putting too fine a point on it, but I feel like Halloween, or, you know, Abel Ferrara's Driller Killer, or, you know, all the Jamie Lee Curtis stuff that comes in the aftermath of Halloween, and then that wave in the 80s of like pure exploitation serial killer, you know, everything from Friday the 13th to, you know, Butcher Baker, Nightmare Maker, you know what I mean? Like all that shit, which I love.
Yeah.
And we'll do an episode about at some point in the next 5 years. It's just like, here are the 80s slashers that nobody talks about that we love. But I feel like they all are disqualified.
I'm game for that.
Would you include a movie like Dirty Harry?
I mean, he's investigating a serial killer.
Literally inspired by the Zodiac.
I think it's fair. It's maybe like its focus is a little bit off where you would want to be a quote unquote serial killer movie, but it's definitely about a serial killer. And I think maybe more so in the spirit of what we're talking about than Halloween is.
Yes, I agree. Let's flag Dirty Harry.
Yeah.
I've also put down Clute, Alan Pakula's incredible film about a prostitute who's being pursued by a killer, and the man who's trying to protect her. R.I.P. Donald Sutherland, by the way, one of his best performances. This feels like a huge influence on Demme and Fincher and the 90s guys. I feel like they were watching this movie, and Charles Ciaffi, the heavy in that movie, is giving like a profoundly uncomfortable performance and seems not quite Longlegs evil, but pretty evil. I have a real fondness for that movie, but I don't know if it should be considered? How are you feeling about this era?
So this is where it gets complicated, and part of the reason why I asked about those icons up front, because I think we should be weighting heavy 80s, 90s. That is the golden era of the genre in a lot of ways. And so we can either pick enough of the founding father origin influences, or do we want to thread some of the influences through, for example, the 70s, even when it's not as prominent? Like Clute is probably more influential than it is popular, if that makes sense.
Definitely.
Like it's not as broad as Seven or Silence of the Lambs, which I think both of those probably have to be locks for this sort of canon. And so for the sake of cutting somewhere, I feel like this is the natural place to trim up a little bit, unfortunately. Not necessarily not including Clute, but that maybe there's only one inclusion from this period or something like that.
What if we did something like this?
Okay.
What if we said, we acknowledge the greatness of The Night of the Hunter and Peeping Tom, but we only choose M and Psycho as representative of their eras. And then in the New Hollywood, as a nod to the slasher era to come, we include Black Christmas or Halloween, these two kind of like watershed moments in modern horror, and Clute. And then we have 4, and then we have 6 spots for 80s and 90s.
Well, the good news is they haven't made a good one of these movies aside from Longlegs in quite a long time.
It's so true. I was going to ask you about that. My theory on that is just that true crime has become so pervasive in our culture, in podcasting and in documentary, that we've like lost our ability to make a scary thriller about these kinds of characters. There have been some in recent years. I made an exhaustive list on Letterboxd, as is my way, which I don't think I shared with you and probably should have. But
it's very weird. I mean, you did share your outline, which is just scrawled with bloody sigils everywhere, which I appreciate.
That's incredibly rude. What is the most recent one? I mean, one thing that is happening right now is we are getting some filmmakers who were not able to tell stories like this. Like Stranger by the Lake is a movie that strikes me as like the Alain Garrod film about a gay serial killer that like is told from a different perspective than a movie you would have gotten. It's very different from Cruising, for example, which we'll talk about shortly.
There's a lot of queer undertones through a lot of these movies, but it's usually played in a way that's either insulting the killer to coax them out, or it's seen as like a societal perversion. And so I think there's a lot of room within those spaces, whether, as you're saying, different kinds of filmmakers and voices making those movies in the first place, or just the way those stories are cracked and told, that could be really interesting. This is what's like why it's such a bummer that there aren't that many of these sorts of serial killer stories anymore. I think a lot of it is, as you're saying, the true crime boom has cannibalized some of that market, if you'll pardon the pun. I think some of it is horror. There's just like more slashers, more exorcisms, more monsters. And the other part of it is probably that making a really, really good one of these often means paying Denzel or Brad Pitt or like a big name actor to either be, or preferably both, the detective and the killer. And so maybe it's just cheaper to crank out a low to mid-budget horror movie instead of that.
It's a great point. I mean, the last one that made, I would say, a profound impact is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
Yes.
Which does what you're describing. It casts James Bond as the detective figure investigating the crime and falling into the world of the killer. You know, there have been a handful of horror movies. I feel like The Black Phone is a pretty good example of like, that's not really a slasher. It kind of feels like a PG-13 movie a lot of the time, even though it's about a child abductor. And never, even though it is a Blumhouse movie and made by Scott Derrickson, who made Insidious, like it is a serial killer movie and it isn't. You know what I mean? Like it's not really about the kills, for lack of a better phrase. And that's probably the noisiest one that we've had in the last few years. You know, I see you gesturing at the little things without saying the little things. The day and date, Denzel, Jared Leto, your favorite actor.
Oh my God. Jared Leto he's certainly in that movie. And
he's in that movie.
I could really do without it.
There's a very upsetting one. I don't know if you've seen the Lars von Trier film, The House That Jack Built, starring Matt Dillon. That's very kind of classically upsetting. But I think you're right that more or less in the last 20 years, 15, 20 years, there hasn't been one. So we have to focus then on the Reagan monsters and the 90s Cruel Wave. These are like the two times where these movies really rise to the fore. So here are the movies I wrote for the 80s. I don't know if you have any additional inclusions you want to note. Cruising, of course, Friedkin's portrait of, Chelsea in New York and the BDSM sex scene in the gay community at that time, and then a serial killer who's kind of making his way through that scene.
A Ringer staple. I would not have guessed that, but it just is.
A beloved classic here at our very normal company.
Yep.
Manhunter, Michael Mann's first crack at the Hannibal Lecter world, but that is really more told through the Red Dragon story. Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer you mentioned, which is a movie that is little seen but hugely influential. And if you have seen it, you know that it, I would say significantly more so than a movie like Longlegs gets under your skin.
Yes.
In which Michael Rooker plays a person compelled to kill, and the way that we see him go through the experiences of murdering and covering up, and almost like, I haven't seen this movie in a while, but I feel like he's almost like trying to quit. He's trying to like beat the bug, beat the machine somehow, and he can't.
He's just a guy out there in this crazy world trying to maybe fall in love, and he also may or may not have killed his mom. It's very normal stuff. But if we're trying to capture archetypes, I do think this is one that could be useful to us. The version of the serial killer movie where you spend most, if not all of the time with the killer. Very different experience than watching something like Zodiac.
Yeah, you mentioned Gerard Carl's Angst as well.
Jesus Christ.
Which is very, very similar to Henry in that way, where you're spending the entirety of the 80-minute runtime almost like with the camera on top of the face of the killer. I mean, it is so awkwardly and purposefully awkwardly shot that you're meant to be unnerved by every angle and every heart palpitation.
That movie opens, he gets out of prison, he goes to a coffee shop, he's having breakfast, and there's an extended scene of him just eating a sausage while leering at these two girls at the counter. That is one of the most upsetting things I've ever seen. It's literally just that.
It's a fucked up classic. When Zach Kreger was on the show to talk about Barbarian, he noted that as like one of the key movies that he thought about, particularly for that kind of sequence in the third act where we see from the perspective of the older man who plays a big part in that story. I don't want to spoil it for people, but the way that sequence is shot is very inspired by Angst. Angst and Henry are tough movies and hard to watch. And yet, whenever you talk about serial killer movies, you kind of have to talk about them. And then I added two like pure Hollywood, I don't know, like go-tos, like easy movies to watch about detectives trying to find a serial killer. The first is Tightrope, which is not the first, but one of a handful of Clint Eastwood movies in which he plays a cop. This one is very sexually charged. I don't know if you had a chance to watch this.
I haven't seen this one, but sexually charged Clint Eastwood is not the flavor I'm accustomed to.
In the film, he explains how erections work to his preteen daughter. So not an ideal scene, honestly.
Nope. Not what you want.
That one wasn't great, but pretty good movie, but also quite lurid in that 80s way where, a lot of strippers are being killed and, but they have to take their clothes off before they get, like that kind of thing. Very clearly very inspired by what had been happening in slashers and bringing like Dirty Harry to a slasher.
Right.
And then Sea of Love, another rewatchable classic starring Al Pacino, that I think that those two movies are hugely influential on what the 90s look like. I don't know if they're good though. So, like, does it matter?
Does the canon have to be good? Is a fair question. I think it needs to have a certain level of quality and staying power and influence, and it's better if they're good. But maybe it's not totally off the table that a movie could be included even if it's not the best.
Well, here's the thing. I don't think we need to do Angst because I think what you can do is you can do Black Christmas as a movie about a serial killer, because that was not a movie that was riffing on any previous iconography. It was like Bob Clark's idea about that POV shot, inspired by Peeping Tom, but setting it in a totally different world, and then creating the archetype of like the sorority killer as a representation of all slashers.
Yes.
So you've got Clute and Black Christmas. And then in the 80s, you have to say, what do we want to represent these kinds of movies? Is it Manhunter and Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer as two sides of the coin? The cop who's obsessed, and then a movie shot through the eyes of the killer? Like, is that enough?
And also, do we want or need Manhunter if we know Silence of the Lambs is coming? Very different movies, but there's a lot of overlap there. And frankly, like, I love Red Dragon. I think Red Dragon is really good, and there's no way it makes this list because Manhunter has a case and is better. I'm tempted to put Manhunter in, but I'm feeling the crunch to come. And we're going to have a conversation about like how many Fincher things make this list. And that's where the girl with the dragon tattoo comes into the conversation as maybe the latest best version of this genre, and I don't think it can make it.
I don't think so either. My suggestion is we definitely put in Henry because
Okay.
Henry feels like a signature in this world, and also maybe
Yes.
like it'll probably be the least seen of the movies that we're going through. Let's talk about that 90s wave. These are the films I wrote down just off the top of my head. Silence of the Lambs, Basic Instinct, which people forget is effectively a serial killer movie.
Yeah.
Natural Born Killers, Funny Games, Michael Haneke's original, not the American remake. Seven, the Seven shit photocopy California with a K.
This movie I have not seen, did not know existed. I kind of can't wait to watch it.
It's honestly so fun, but it's terrible, but it's so fun.
Mm.
It's about um it's about an author and an artist who are attempting to go on like a journey across the country to discover like the real America, and they encounter murderous Brad Pitt and his girlfriend Juliette Lewis. This is like the same year roughly as Natural Born Killers.
Wow. Yeah.
Very strange movie. Kind of effective. Dominic Sena directed it. Guy who made Gone in 60 Seconds and was part of like that director's crew that included like a lot of former music video directors like David Fincher. He's kind of from that wave of filmmakers. Movie has a ton of style. Terrible script. Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Cure, which just came up on this show because Adam Naiman pointed out that Chime, this new Kurosawa film, is one of the best things of 2024. And this is a movie that I think has been really like discovered in the last 10 years. It was issued by the Criterion Collection.
Definitely.
Anybody who wasn't really closely following Japanese cinema or Asian cinema really has a leg on that now. And then Audition, which I don't even know if Audition qualifies as a serial killer movie, the Takashi Miike movie, but that's a movie that when I was 18 or 19, people were like, "Yo, you got to fucking see this!" Like the video store nerds, and were like compelling you because of its outrageousness and its violence and its sense of absurdity. I don't, how we choose in the 90s is hard. Silence of the Lambs and Seven to me are locks.
I think they have to be. I mean, Silence of the Lambs is just the best pure serial killer movie ever made. Seven is probably the most influential movie of all of these beyond that in terms of what the modern version of these films look like.
Mm-hmm.
They've got to be there. Beyond there, yeah, I'm tempted to rule out Audition on genre. I also think Basic Instinct might be too much erotic thriller, not enough serial killer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm drawn towards, if we're going to include other movies of this era, Natural Born Killers as our stand-in for the sort of murder spree version of this story.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily for me, Natural Born Killers. It's a lot.
So flawed. It's incredibly flawed. It is an electrifying document.
Yes.
Like it's Stone, I think, in his most interesting period by far. I feel like he's losing his grip on what he's trying to do, like often in the movie, and in a way that is entertaining. And that's a movie that watching it on cable as a kid definitely opened my mind up to what movies could be because of him changing film stocks and color. And, when he starts showing us like the Rodney Dangerfield character as if he were in like a bad sitcom, those creative decisions and all the Robert Downey Jr.,
he is super funny. Like as the
so
weird
funny.
Aussie host of American Psychopaths or whatever that show is called.
Yes. And that sense of satire. But also, like, honestly, I've always wanted to just see the Quentin Tarantino version of Natural Born Killers that Stone, like, just didn't make. They rewrote and kind of ripped apart and kind of missed the point of what the original screenplay was. Obviously, I'm quite biased towards Tarantino when it comes to these things, but I've heard him talk about that so many times now. It's hard for me to, like, fully get on board with that movie. So, but you're right, though, that there was this wave of movies about people traveling across the country and killing people.
Yes. And again, another one where we spend time with the killers for the most part. It's very broad in its way, like obviously loud editing style, loud composition style. I would say you watched it in maybe the optimal form, which is on TV. Like it's a very channel surfy kind of experience.
Yeah.
It might be the messaging. Look, far be it for me to question Oliver Stone. I'm trying to get his very delicate messaging in this movie right. I think he might be saying that the glorification of violence is bad.
I think there's a part of him too that is like we're all murderers. Like we've all murdered our culture, because of our craven desires. There's definitely a part of like you two are watching American Psychopaths at home, hosted by Aussie Robert Downey Jr., and you're gross.
Yeah.
But I just think that movie is like all thumbs. And sometimes you need your thumbs to play video games, but it's just so inelegant.
Yes. Inelegant is a good word. Very elegant though, and I would make a strong push for this movie, even if it needs to be my sort of fringe case. I think Funny Games might need to be in there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, are they serial killers? Like, is this something that we feel like this duo who stumble into this suburban family's home and torture them and eventually do worse?
Well,
is that something they do all the
spoiler
time?
alert for Funny Games. If you've not seen this movie and are delicate about what the ending of it might be, just jump forward like 30 seconds. I think the fact that we see this just genuinely one of the most unsettling and upsetting movies play out with the torture of this family in their own vacation home. And then at the end of it, the two guys who are just the perfect serial killers and that they're only fucking punks with gloves on. That's their only real attribute. Yep. They get on a boat and they go across the lake and they start the same routine with a new family. That's what makes me feel, okay, we're in serial killer territory at this point.
Okay, so there's another movie, like this is kind of a trilogy in a strange way. So Funny Games, Natural Born Killers, and American Psycho kind of operate in this triangulated fashion where they're simultaneously satires and also very upsetting.
Right.
And they're kind of like, elbowing the audience in the rib cage the entire time. They're like, you're fucking gross, aren't you? You're sick. Like consumption and desire and all of these ideas that you're interested in, they make you like a little animal. Oh, you're a man, you want to fuck a woman? That's gross. You want to kill somebody? You're disgusting. And equating these ideas, smashing them together, contradicting them. But they represent something very 90s. Like they are sort of like the Beck's Odelay of serial killer movies where you're like, okay, so they pulled this from here and this from here. And I love that about them. And I'm totally a product of that generation, of that era. And to be confronted with that stuff as a teenager was very influential on me and the stuff that I like. I don't really know what the best version of those three things is.
Yeah.
Like, can you make a serial killer movie without putting American Psycho the movie in? I feel like you kind of have to put it in. But then if you put it in, you can't put in two Fincher movies, that's for sure. Like you really have to make hard choices. So is Funny Games representative enough for that kind of idea that we're talking about?
I would say Funny Games does capture the home invasion stuff. It captures some of what you're talking about, but also, all of these movies with serial killers are playing off of, human depravity and the sexuality you're talking about. It also taps into something about the way that all of this stuff is difficult to articulate, like the long legs of something being so unsettling and you can't quite say why. Like these two guys coming into your home and being aggressively polite, but also hit you in the knee with a golf club. There's something there that I do want to capture, whether it's here or not. I wonder if American Psycho can nudge its way into a different lane, which is the sort of more gonzo satire part of this, which I do think should be represented in some way, whether it's this or Serial Mom or like some version of one of those movies.
Another great example. Absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, okay. So
like, I think we need something on that end of the spectrum, whatever it is.
Okay. Let's just say for the sake of conversation, we're including Funny Games and American Psycho as two different versions of a related idea. That puts us at M, Psycho, Clute, Henry, Silence of the Lambs, Funny Games, American Psycho 7. That's 8.
Good Lord.
We have not yet discussed Zodiac or anything from the 2000s. We also haven't added. I also think Memories of Murder probably has to go in.
I think it's gotta go. Gotta go.
So that's Bong Joon-ho's amazing 2003 film, which is very influential on Zodiac. And Fincher and Bong have this like great game of pass the baton where like you can feel each other watching the other one's movies and being inspired by them and taking something from them. And no surprise, two of my favorites on the show. So, but if you just put Memories of Murder and then you're at 9.
Yeah.
We don't have a slasher. And yet, like, I haven't given you even like a shot at a weird one. Like,
God,
would you be okay with only one movie from the last 20 years?
I mean, I think Zodiac has to be in there too. I think we do have to have two. Like, no other filmmaker, I would say, has dedicated a larger portion of their mind space and body of work to this genre than David Fincher.
Yes. We haven't even mentioned all the mind hunting that he was
Yes.
doing, which is, of course, not a film, but Mind Hunter sits comfortably in the lone spot we reserve in this canon for television. No
There's only
disrespect
one
to the
spot?
television series
It's not for
Hannibal.
like the Dahmer, Evan Peters experiment. It's not for that.
Didn't make the cut, sadly.
It's tough.
Sorry, Dahmer. Nor did any of the Dahmer films. That's
There's
the
a
other
lot.
thing, too, is most of these movies are not about real cases. In fact, are any of these movies about real cases?
I mean, Zodiac, Memories of Murder.
Zodiac, yes.
I feel like a lot of them are it's a lot of inspired by, and they'll twist some details, they'll change some settings, but I think there's a degree to which a lot of this stuff almost has to come from somewhere in reality. It's very hard to dream up this level of, again, depravity if you're not of it.
I agree, but by the same token, I'm less interested in the Ted Bundy story.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Or the Gacy story than I am. We're pulling pieces and ideas from real life events and integrating them into something from a different perspective. I mean, we can just be done. Like, we can just say we've made our choices and live with our choices. If you want to say,
do we have 10?
M, Psycho, Clute, Henry, Silence of the Lambs.
You're dropping Black Christmas.
I'm holding it for now.
Okay.
Funny Games, American Psycho, 7. Memories of Murder, Zodiac. That's 10.
Did you say Silence of the Lambs?
I believe so, yes.
I mean, I don't hate that 10.
It's pretty good. Any honorable mentions you want to make? I mean, we could. I think we can hold off on the threatened slasher idea because I got slasher ideas for days for the pod.
It's true.
We'll circle back.
There's space for that stuff.
There is. What was your big discovery? Anything that you saw? You texted me about Freeway.
I love
Freeway.
I love Freeway. Do
movie.
people know about Freeway?
Tell them.
There's this movie called Freeway in which Reese Witherspoon, in deep white trash Southern accent, is doing an elaborate Red Riding Hood pastiche. But imagine this, and I'm going to spoil this movie, but I think it's worth it to explain exactly what's happening here. She's picked up by Kiefer Sutherland as a big bad wolf highway serial killer. But she turns the tables on him, shoots him like 8 to 10 times, and the back half of the movie is the big bad wolf pressing charges against Red Riding Hood. That's what this movie is. How is that not on our canon? How is that not a bigger part of American movie history?
Fun fact about that movie is they made a sequel to that movie and recast the Reese Witherspoon part with Natasha Lyonne. Are you familiar with this?
Oh, yeah.
Freeway 2.
Confessions of a Trick Baby is the subtitle.
The 90s were so good, Rob. You can't believe how great we had it. Another movie that I just stumbled upon on cable while sleeping in my dad's house in like 1997. And I was like, is this real? Is this the girl from Man in the Moon? This is her next film?
I miss that feeling. I miss the feeling you were talking about earlier too about Audition of the like, this is so fucked up, you gotta watch it. And I don't know if we have that anymore because things are so available. I think there was a point where Angst was hard to watch and now it's on Tubi.
Yeah, I know. I have a beautiful restoration on Blu-ray of Angst. I'm like, why do I own this? This is depraved. Like if the FBI came to my home, they'd haul me off just knowing I own all these movies. But I do.
Maybe so.
But I
wrote down one line from
today.
Freeway that I want to hit, which is this key line from Reese. You act like you're on a mission, but all you want to do is get off in a sex type way. And I feel like that's the mission of all of these movies, and also maybe in some ways the big picture podcast. So
do you get off in any other way? Do you get off in any other way besides a sex type way?
I mean, people are getting off in all kinds of ways in these movies. People are just in Memories of Murder. A guy just shows up to the crime scene to crank it. Is that a sex type way? I don't know. I'm gonna leave that to the scientists.
This wouldn't be an episode of The Big Picture without someone cranking it too. So really well done by you, Rob. I feel like we did a good job. I'm sure people will have their quibbles. They'll be mad that we didn't include. I don't know. What's a critical film that we did not include in our list?
Do we need Monster? Does female serial killer representation matter?
Well, here's the thing about Monster. Obviously, there's an amazing performance by Charlize Theron in the film, Academy Award-winning performance. I don't think that movie is great. Like, I think we're talking about movies that are like orders of magnitude better.
Yes.
So I think it's an interesting idea. And of course, Eileen Wuornos is a fascinating cultural figure. There are very few examples of female serial killers in history. Is she maybe the only one, actually? But
It's a lot of female victims in these movies, to the surprise of no one.
But it falls into that same thing I was describing, where I'm less interested in docudrama of these stories than I am in the kind of creation of a world that may be inspired by, but isn't representing something that actually happened.
Yeah.
So for me, that one is not as interesting. Zodiac, I like so much because it is less about the kills and it is more about the investigation, which of course is like maybe the best example of that, paired with Memories of Murder in terms of exploring who the people are who try to solve these crimes and what it does to them.
But also the kills. I think that the picnic murder in Zodiac is one of the scariest things I've ever seen.
You're 100% right. I think we did well. I think this is good. I think there are plenty of good movies. I'll tweet out my Letterboxd link so people can see that, you know, Jennifer 8 is on my list, and Link.
You're doing the work.
Copycat, you know, Kiss the Girls starring Morgan Freeman, The Cell starring Jennifer Lopez, a film that takes place entirely in the mind of a serial killer.
If we had more time and space, I might have made a run at The Cell as a token inclusion.
Cool movie. You know, looks amazing.
It does look amazing.
Yeah. Joanna Robinson's beloved Tarsum Singe. Rob, thank you so much. Thanks for really going down the rabbit hole of depravity with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for taking me to the deepest and darkest places of the human spirit.
Thanks to Rob Mahoney. Thanks to Jack Sanders. And thanks to our producer, Bobby Wagner, for their work on this episode. Next week, we've got a new draft coming your way. I'm not going to spoil the subject matter. See you then.